Alrighty, everybody. Good morning. Welcome to the very first meeting of the Kingston Heritage Properties Committee. There's Councillor Oosterhoff's camera on. We're just waiting currently on one extra member, Melanie Wilson, but we will get started just with some introductions. So as I've introduced myself to all of you, but just in case you are unaware, my name is Ian Sullivan. I am the committee clerk assigned to this committee. Before we also get started with the committee introductions, just want to quickly point out we will be meeting them shortly, but behind us on the bench there is Dr. Campbell, the Director of Heritage Services, and all of her wonderful staff. They'll be providing an introduction to themselves later on. Also, just before we get started, please make sure when you're, as Councillor Glenn and Councillor Oosterhoff, if he was here, would know, the mics are a bit finicky. So you want to make sure that you press the button at the very bottom left, I believe, on the thing. It will have a little power bar, and you'll see a little red ring around the mic when they turn on. They are pretty flexible, so you can move them around to make sure you can get nice and heard. The audio in this chamber is quite echoey, so you want to make sure that you kind of get nice and close to the microphone when you would like to make a comment. With all that out of the way, I will start to my left. So Alex, if you would like to get us started, just a brief introduction of who you are, and we'll go from there. Just use the microphone, just so that everyone can hear, because Councillor Oosterhoff is virtual, so he won't be able to hear you unless you speak into the microphone.
So I'm Alex Lignini. This is my first time serving on this committee. I'm a lifelong Kingston resident, long interest in heritage, and looking forward to meeting you guys.
Good morning. My name is Gunnar Heisler. I guess I'm the freshman here. And I don't think I need any further introduction. Thank you.
My name's Ann Stevens. I've lived in Kingston since 1981. Love the heritage here. I'm a retired journalist with also public relations experience in media relations, but I'm really happy to be on this committee and look forward to the work.
Good morning. I'm Jane McFarlane. I've been a Heritage Kingston member for the last 4 years. I'm a retired educator and graduate of the St. Lawrence College Carpenter General Certificate Program. I've had first-hand and personal experience with the heritage permit process, having restored and renovated a Part 4 designated heritage property, which I currently live in and am the primary maintenance person for. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Connie Glenn. I am the councillor for Sydenham District, and when I'm not at council, I'm a practicing ergonomist with my own business, and happy to have everyone here joining us today.
Hello, I am Jen Demetor. I'm the principal architect at Fabricate Architecture. Like Jane, I've been on the committee for 4 years. Occasionally, you will see me on the other side, putting through properties and changes. So look forward to working with you guys, and welcome. And if you have any questions, reach out to us. We know it's like it's a lot of literature to go through and understand and stuff. We've been there, so hi.
And now, last but not least, Councillor Oosterhoff.
Yes, good morning. Thanks, Ian. And I'm really glad to meet you all. I apologize I'm not there this morning. I look forward to being there. And I'm Gary Ostro, councillor for Countryside, and I'm pleased to be continuing on with heritage. In my other life, I'm an electrical contractor and involved with electrical safety board in Toronto. So I have made a career in construction and many projects in heritage homes. And this committee has grown on me a lot. I've really enjoyed. I have a growing passion for heritage and for this amazing city that we're all part of, and wanting to see always be at its best. So I'm proud to serve with each and one of you, every one of you. Thank you.
Okay, so the first item on the agenda that it is my duty to do is the election of officers. So do I have a volunteer or a nomination for the position of chair? Councillor Glenn? Are you volunteering or, yeah, okay, volunteering. Do I have a seconder for Councillor Glenn? I have Oosterhoff and I have Jane McFarland seconding. 1 second while I get that into my notes here. Are there any other nominations? Seeing none, I will call the vote. All those in favor of Councillor Glenn as chair of the committee. And that is carried. So Councillor Glenn, please make your way up to the big seat. While you're making your way up, I will do the quick election for vice chair. Do I have a nomination for the position of vice chair? Jane, you put your name forward? Perfect. Do I have a second, moved and seconded by, there you go. 1 sec. Let me just put that in. So Vice Chair Jane. We'll have moved by Councillor Glenn, seconded by Jennifer Demeter. Any other nominations? Seeing none. All those in favor? And that is approved. Perfect. Thank you very much.
Well, welcome and thank you. I'm looking forward to chairing, and I'm looking forward to this new committee. So with that, I'm going to call the meeting to order. And Ian, you're noting the time, I'm assuming. Okay, so our next order of business is to move to the approval of the agenda. So could I have a mover for that, please? Jennifer, thank you. Seconded by Gary. And are there any additions? Jane.
Actually, this is a correction regarding 2312 Princess Street. Page 41 of the agenda attributes the heritage reviewer name to myself when that was actually submitted by Donald Taylor. And my heritage review correctly is attributed to me on page 42.
Okay, that's noted. Thank you. And so with that, can I get a vote for the approval of the agenda? All in favor? Okay, and that's carried. Okay, and we have no minutes, seeing as this is the first official meeting for this committee. Okay, so do I have any disclosures of pecuniary interest? All right, seeing none. There are also no delegations. So we're now on to briefings. So I'm going to recognize Ms. Campbell and ask her to come up.
Usually the rest of the team who are here to speak with you. But it's an absolute pleasure today to welcome you all as members of the Heritage Properties Committee, a new committee that was formed at just the end of last year. And we're very excited to move forward with the work of Heritage with this group, but also with your corresponding Heritage Programming Committee, which you may want to kind of follow along with at times as well. So that being said, I am Jennifer Campbell. I'm the Director of Heritage Services. And I just, again, want to take some time to orient the rest of this orientation and to introduce you to members of our team. We have Ryan Leary at the end, who is our Senior Heritage Planner and currently our Acting Manager of Heritage Planning as well. We have hired a Heritage Planner. We're very excited to have someone joining us mid-April. So at your next meeting, you will get an opportunity to meet our new manager. And Ryan's been doing an excellent, excellent job. But we're excited to get him back fully in his Senior Planner role. Next to him, we have Phil Prell, who is our Intermediate Heritage Planner. And then here at the end, we have Nikki Kensett, who is our Heritage Planner. So again, welcome. We're very excited to have you here. We have a lot of heritage to care about in the city of Kingston. It makes our work, I think, challenging, exciting, complex, and at times it can seem overwhelming. So we're hoping through this orientation today we can help you to not perhaps be overwhelmed when you receive heavy agenda packages from us, requests for feedback on submissions, or if you need assistance in your analysis and your feedback on any of the work that we bring forward to you. So our Heritage Services Department, not specific to this committee, but I think it's helpful to understand our department as a whole. Our department as a whole supports not only the properties group, but also the programming group. It's our responsibility within the city to support the care and stewardship of natural, tangible, and intangible heritage resources in Kingston. And I say to colleagues and friends all the time, if you're talking about heritage in Kingston, you're talking about everything. Because we are a heritage city and we are built, on historic grounds. We have a long history of occupation through First Nations and Indigenous history, right up to the modern day where we're continuing to innovate, create, and vision what our city should look like as we move forward. So we take that very seriously and we're very passionate about it as a team. Our department then is responsible for the legislation that is managed through the Ontario Heritage Act, and that includes our Heritage Planning Group here before you. We handle things like property changes that you're going to know so well through your work here, but we also support the Planning Department with larger development applications. Those will sometimes come to you as well. And we support archaeology, which you may not realize is also part of the Ontario Heritage Act. And so that has an entire legislative process that we move through as well. You may occasionally see some of that here. On the side of the house that you'll hear less from, but should know about, we also manage the two city museums, the Pump House and the McLaughlin, as well as the operation of City Hall as a National Historic Site, including its visitation through the public, as well as supporting FMCS, our Facilities Maintenance and Construction Services team, who work on the care and maintenance of the building, as you can see is happening right now in council chambers. We're responsible for the Heritage Resource Centre, which is downstairs on the first floor to the rear of the building, if you look at it from Ontario Street, a space where property owners, people interested in history and heritage can come, get planning assistance, or also receive assistance with, we often get donations. I have this beautiful old thing. I would like the city to have it. So we are very happy to have that resource. We are one of few cities in Ontario to actually dedicate a space within our municipal practice for such an education facility. We're responsible then for the civic artifact collection. We have approximately 20,000 objects in the collection, and an additional probably 25,000 archaeological resources as well. So a very significant trust of material that we hold on behalf of the City of Kingston and actually the province of Ontario and really anyone in Canada. We are also responsible for community-wide interpretive projects, programs, and heritage activations. What does that mean? Well, walking tours, community education opportunities about heritage properties. We host lectures in Memorial Hall at times to talk about heritage, anything from stonework to discussions about, oh gracious, prison farms was one that was tremendously popular a couple of years ago. But we also do all of our programming out of our museum sites, as well as in partnership with other agencies and organizations across the city. And we also, we are incredibly proud to be a part of supporting the Indigenous initiatives at the City of Kingston. For those who have worked with the city for some time, you may know of this as Engage for Change, a project that has concluded now as an initiative over a 6-year period, but is now importantly transitioning to Indigenous initiatives at the City of Kingston. So the work we do also is thinking about how we work in a shared approach to reconciliation and community education and understanding, but also bringing Indigenous ways of knowing and being into the work of the city. And so you may at times see that come up through this committee, but it will also come up through the programming committee more frequently. So I think you all know, cultural heritage is this big bucket. We used to have one committee to deal with it as a whole, and we found that to be pretty unwieldy, to be quite honest. It was too much for one committee to handle. So we've got 2 committees now. We as a department are basically one. But we divide that work out now into 2, even though we think of heritage in these kind of tangible, intangible, and natural buckets. So just to put some thinking around what that means for you, when we talk about tangible, obviously that's the easy one, the things you can touch. Sometimes we talk about movable and immovable, if you want to look to the UNESCO definitions. But tangible for you, for an example, would be like the Martello Tower. You can touch it, right? It's there. Intangible would be the history around the Martello Tower, right? The knowledge we have about its use and activation through time. And natural might be the shoreline and the environment in which the tower is situated. So there you can see all three pieces. They intersect, they overlap, they're complex, which is at times why the complexity will come to this committee for consideration as well. You most often, though, will be dealing with tangible. The things you can touch, the things you can alter, the things you can restore and conserve, or perhaps with pain at times, let go. And that's an important part of the discussions that we'll be having here with you. So just to kind of wrap up my section, I do want to say that the Heritage Properties Committee, in its role as an advisory committee, is kind of twofold. Certainly it's an advisory group to provide recommendations and support for recommendations to council. It's also an opportunity for staff to have the benefit of working with you, to understand the community perspective, to understand the impacts to neighborhoods, and to get that feedback from you. And we'll talk more about DASH and how we want to receive feedback, to get your feedback early enough in the process that we can actually consider it alongside of the things that we may be considering more through policy and legislation considerations. So our job is to sort of assess, does this hold water if we were to move it forward based on all the legislation, on the policy? Would it stand up to review if someone was to appeal it? And does it sort of jive, if you will, with our understanding of where and how the community would like to see its heritage resources protected? Your jobs, in some ways, are not necessarily to do all that policy review work. It's to let us know how you're feeling as representatives of community, as knowledgeable people with heritage experience, about whether or not something looks or feels right to you from your perspective. Absolutely, you can ask questions of policy. Absolutely, you can point to acts, parts of legislation. We're certainly here to take that in as well, but we really do want to see your feedback. You have statutory and non-statutory responsibilities, just as we do. The statutory are those that come under the Ontario Heritage Act. The committee has various roles depending on the kinds of applications we're working with and through. And as we move through them over the next several meetings, when you get a new kind of aspect of the act coming forward for your consideration, we are going to make sure we take the time to sort of do a little bit more on those orientations so that you're comfortable and you come to understand what we mean when we say this is a Part 4 application and this is a Part 5 application. And oh my gracious, this is a pre-consultation on a heritage easement agreement. So we will help to move all those pieces forward, but those are legislative requirements. And the committee has a very specific role in them that is outlined through the Ontario Heritage Act and is supported through our procedural bylaw. You will also have opportunity to give support and input on things that are non-legislative, all right? These are things where your active consultation is simply that. It's an active consultation. It's a desire to get your community feedback and input on something that may not actually require by law your input, but we would like to have your input because it is something that will change the heritage landscape in Kingston or contribute and grow it. An example of that would be the I in Kingston sign a couple of years back. That came to the committee as an active consultation, did not require a heritage permit, but certainly we got great feedback from this committee or the previous iteration of this committee about what and how that sign should look moving forward. So there's lots more to share. We will take time to share it as we go forward. But at this point, I'm going to go back and take my seat, which is where you'll usually find me, and invite Ryan up to kind of move us forward through the next several slides. I also just want to say before I go, normally briefings will not be as long as this one. So this is an orientation briefing. It will take much longer than it normally would take. Normally, we try to cap this at like 5-10 minutes tops. So thank you again for your patience. Cheers.
Thank you, Jen. And yeah, usually we try to be brief, and this is a brief presentation for everything that this committee will see and experience over the next few years. We tried to hit a lot of the high-level stuff today, because there is a lot of deep dive, nitty-gritty stuff that we will get into a little bit further as items arise that require that direction. So, saying that though, my name is Ryan. I'm the senior heritage planner with the city. I've been here now 11 years, making me, I guess, the sort of senior member on this team. And I get the fun job of taking you through some of the legislative framework for what you're looking at this committee. So the Heritage Act obviously is the most key piece of provincial legislation that you'll be working with. It serves as the main framework for cultural heritage conservation in Ontario. There are 7 parts to the Act. You will hear us refer to Parts 4 and Parts 5. They are the municipal tools that we use out of the Act, and we will sometimes dabble in the other sections as need arises. Part 6 has to do with archaeology. Part 3 has to do with the Heritage Trust, things that may come up. But for our main day-to-day kind of work and the things the committee will see, we will be referring to them as Part 4 properties and Part 5 properties. The Part 4s are those individual designations. They are, that part of the Act deals with establishing a heritage register, which you hear us refer to. It also is the part of the Act that establishes this committee as the Municipal Heritage Committee for the City of Kingston. It also has to do with things like easement agreements and listed properties. All of that falls under what we refer to as Part 4. And the designations, of course, which are individual properties that are designated for their individual merits. Part 5, conversely, is the districts. So the Market Square District, the Old Sydenham District, Berryfield District. So the Heritage Conservation Districts, how those are established, the plans that go with them, and the means by which we review alterations and demolitions and new construction in districts. So those are the 2 main parts that you'll be dealing with in that regard. I did that without looking at my notes, so I want to make sure I covered everything. Director Campbell spoke to this a little bit. Some of the non-statutory responsibilities of this committee, as part of fulfilling its mandate, it's expected that this committee will support certain advisory and consultative responsibilities for staff and council as need arises. Other examples have to do with, we have policies that relate to the windows and how they're conserved. We have policies related to masonry and how masonry is conserved. And those are brought to this committee for consultation. Pre-consultation, our formal pre-consultation process, which Director Campbell spoke to, where you get a chance to talk directly with a developer, a proponent, on usually it's a larger application, larger alteration or new construction, and you get a chance to feed into their conceptual thinking at an early stage in their proposal. So larger projects that have bigger impacts, where the proponents are sort of feeling things out on what's acceptable, and they really appreciate getting feedback from this group in the past. So, and the other one is the Heritage Properties Working Group, which is a working group that are members of this committee as well as public members, and we review draft designation bylaws and educational material for the public and that type of thing, and their briefing notes and their projects come back to the committee for review and comment. So the works that help to situate, like these help to situate built heritage in a broader context. It helps to ensure that Kingston's history and heritage is more widely understood and appreciated. This work tends to be cyclical or longer term in nature and involves internal and external stakeholders, and it has the potential to affect the vitality and sustainability of built heritage in the city. So it's an important part. And the last slide I just wanted to mention was staff's role. And again, Director Campbell spoke to this a little bit. We have what we call sort of a complementary role to the committee. We have a slightly different responsibility than the Heritage Committee does. Our team, we have a heritage planning team, which you see before you tonight, that is part of the Heritage Services Department. We help navigate the murky waters of the various requirements and application procedures and the administration of the various roles and responsibilities and timelines and notice requirements of the Heritage Act, and promoting heritage conservation in the city. The director, as you met, helps steer our department to fulfill council's strategic priorities. The director also has specific approval authorities for certain things under the Heritage Act that were delegated by council. The manager leads the heritage planning team, organizes our 3 heritage planners to fulfill those directions, and is going to be typically the representative of our team at these committee meetings. The three planners, myself included, act on those directions. We are the direct point of contact, usually for applicants, property owners. We prepare staff's professional opinions in reports that are brought to this committee and council, including applications for various things through the Heritage Act. So we work together as a team to support and assist heritage property owners, this committee, other stakeholders, and other internal departments, as well as council, to conserve the heritage and resources of the city. The Heritage Planning team are required to follow the legislation set out by the Province of Ontario and the Heritage Act, as well as the direction set out in the Provincial Policy Statement, PPS as we call it, and the City of Kingston Official Plan. Built heritage matters in the PPS are noted, they note that, quote, significant built heritage resources and significant cultural heritage landscapes shall be conserved. So that's the provincial direction that we're following. And on a local level, our City of Kingston Official Plan notes that its heritage goal is to conserve and enhance built heritage resources within the City of Kingston so that they may be assessed, experienced, and appreciated by all residents and visitors, and retained in an appropriate manner and setting as a valued public trust held for future generations. It's a pretty lofty goal that our official plan sets. The committee, as the director mentioned, is to act as the public's voice on matters related to heritage conservation. Staff's role is complementary but slightly different in that staff assist by interpreting the Heritage Act, the city's various bylaws and plans, as well as other related legislation, and makes its own recommendation to council, sometimes slightly different or separate from committee's recommendation. City council then, of course, gets the benefit of having received advice from both staff and the committee in order to make a thoughtful and fully informed decision on heritage conservation matters. So with that, I will pass it over to my colleague Nikki to walk you through our heritage register.
Hello, everybody. So I'm Nikki. I'm the newest member of the Heritage team. I've been here for about 3 months almost, just about around that time. So, you know, this is all new for everyone here and me as well, so we can learn together. I'm going to kind of go into a little bit of the Heritage Properties Register that you can find on our website. So the Ontario Heritage Act provides several avenues by which municipalities may conserve built heritage resources. In accordance with this provision of the Act, all properties that are of cultural heritage value or interest are included in the city's Heritage Register. The City of Kingston has a lot of properties on the municipal register. We have some 1,200 properties. This includes 1 UNESCO World Heritage Site, 25 National Historic Sites, 2 properties of provincial interest, 3 heritage conservation districts, which we'll talk about more later, about 600 designated properties, and over 300 listed properties. So there is a lot that we take a look at. If I can move this. No. Let me find my mouse, sorry. Ian, you want to help me find the mouse? I can't find it, I'm sorry. Yeah, brilliant, thank you. So listed properties, under Section 27 of the Ontario Heritage Act, this allows municipalities to include properties on the register that they believe to be of cultural heritage value or interest, but have not been fully researched or formally designated yet. A listed property must meet at least one of the provincial criteria for determining cultural heritage value under OREG 906. Listing a property was, until recently, a way of taking inventory of one's resources and provided a minimal level of protection without undertaking a full designation. However, now, once a property is listed, the city only has 2 years from the time of listing to designate the property. If that timeline is not met, the property will be removed from the register for a period of 5 years before it has another opportunity to be added back onto the register. So we have some timelines to be met right now. We have one application today that's going to be brought forward later on that is related to a listed property. When we get to this agenda item, we'll go into further details about it. As for individual property designations, also known as Part 4 designated properties, these are enabled by Section 29 of the Ontario Heritage Act. New designating bylaws include a statement of cultural heritage value, which outlines how the property meets the provincial criteria for determining cultural heritage value, OREG 906. At least 2 of the criteria must be met for a property to be considered for designation. A designation bylaw also outlines the property's heritage attributes. Heritage attributes are physical elements of the property that reflect and define its heritage value, and that are the utmost importance of conserving the property's heritage value. Council shall consult with the Heritage Properties Committee, all of you, before designating or de-designating or amending a designating bylaw for individually designated properties. Under the Act, any demolition, removal, or alterations that are likely to impact the property's heritage attributes require prior approval by Council, following consultation with this committee. So you guys are very important. These heritage attributes are physical features that are typically various architectural features. As there are many different architectural terms, we will be emailing each and every one of you a virtual handout today that contains the most common architectural features within the city. This is going to provide you with a little bit more guidance on the terms that we use. I know I reference this file a lot myself because there's a lot out there. We also have one application being brought forward today that is a Part 4 designation. And as for a Heritage Conservation District Plan, also known as an HCD, this is enabled by Section 41 and 42 of the Ontario Heritage Act, and the City of Kingston can designate any defined area as a Heritage Conservation District, also known as a Part 5, provided that at least 25% of the properties satisfy 2 of the 9 criteria for determining cultural heritage value or interest. This is also referencing OREG 906. The purpose of a Heritage Conservation District is to guide change in neighborhoods that represent the City of Kingston's social, cultural, and architectural history. All districts must also have an enabling conservation district plan, which includes a statement of heritage value and attributes, as well as policies and guidelines and a broader objective for how the district can change or evolve while conserving its heritage character and value. Council shall consult with the Heritage Properties Committee before any new Heritage Conservation District plans are created. Furthermore, Council must consult with the Heritage Committee prior to making decisions for new constructions or demolitions within an HCD. However, municipalities' Heritage Committee is not required to be consulted for alterations to the properties of an HCD. We also have one application today that is going to be under an HCD or a Part 5. So we have something underneath every single section of the policies today. So it's going to be a really well-rounded meeting, I think. I will pass this on to Phil now.
Through you, Madam Chair. So despite the common misconception that heritage properties are, quote, locked in time, protected heritage properties also evolve and change. The purpose of requiring prior approval for these changes to heritage properties is to ensure that the reasons why these properties are special, specifically their heritage attributes, are not lost or inappropriately changed. However, not every change to a protected heritage property requires prior approval. Under the Ontario Heritage Act, municipal approval is required for alterations that are, quote, are likely to impact, end quote, a heritage attribute as defined in the individual designating bylaw, and for properties in a heritage conservation district where that type of alteration is not exempt under the district plan. So to start, where no approval is required, these include interior works unless designated, which in this city is far less common. For landscaping work, which does not require heavy machinery, maintenance, as defined in the Heritage Procedural Bylaw, or any works exempt in a Heritage Conservation District Plan, as mentioned previously. Stream 1 is for staff's delegated authority and can include changes that staff determine to have no significant impact on the property's heritage attributes, re-roofing using a similar material, painting, window repairs in line with the city's window policy, repointing a masonry in line with the city's masonry policy, and minor repairs to existing features. Stream 2 is for delegated authority for Part 4 applications, such as one of them that is before you today later on. And these are only applicable for Part 4 designated properties if, following the committee review, committee staff and the applicant have no concerns with the approval and associated conditions, the Director of Heritage Services has the delegated authority to approve this application. Stream 3 is for council approval, which necessitates Heritage Property Committee review and council approval. This includes any works outside of those approved under Streams 1 for Part 4 or Part 5 designated properties, any applications under Part 4 designated properties where either staff, committee, or the applicant are not in agreement on the outcome or conditions, and demolition/relocation applications. Sometimes staff will encourage applicants to undergo a pre-consultation process with the committee for more complex applications before submitting their application for approval under the Ontario Heritage Act. However, this is not a requirement, but a good chance for the committee to provide preliminary feedback and comments in an early development stage to help the project be as good as it can be. Next, I want to provide an overview of what a typical day in the life of a Heritage Properties Committee member usually entails. First, the committee is circulated on a proposal that staff have deemed complete. Then, once circulated, the committee members can review and upload material. The committee members can review the uploaded material, which can include the designation bylaw, applicant plans, or rationale, site photos, etc. During this process, there is an opportunity for follow-up questions to staff, which can be relayed to the applicant as necessary. Then, before the staff report is finalized, the committee provides written comment via Dash, which will be touched on briefly later, and via email after this, which will be included in the publicly available final report, as well as be shared with the applicant. Typically, after the circulation period for the application is ended, staff cannot accept further official comments until the meeting, but we are always available to answer any questions. A bit more on this in the next few slides. Oh, my apologies, went a little far ahead there. Before the actual meeting, all members should have read the associated staff reports and have prepared any comments/remarks for questions for staff and/or the applicant. Finally, the committee meets to discuss the application with staff and the applicant and provides formal recommendations to council, or lends its support or non-support for staff's recommendations or the director approval of a Stream 2 application, specifically in the venue we are, my apologies, specifically in the venue we are currently. Sorry about that. Hopefully no one's ears exploded there. Should the application proceed to council for a decision, the entire staff report, including the entire official set of committee comments submitted on Dash and the feedback provided during the Heritage Properties Committee, will be available for council to review prior to rendering a decision, similar to what Ryan said earlier. Once an application has been approved by council or the director, staff will prepare a scope of work, similar to what you can see in the slide here, and send this to the applicant for posting at the property while the works are being undertaken. A heritage permit is valid for 3 years from the date of approval. Importantly, in the event that council denies an application under the Ontario Heritage Act or approves it with conditions that are unsatisfactory to the owner and only the owner can appeal the decision to the Ontario Land Tribunal, whose decision is final. Under the Ontario Heritage Act, the council has 90 days to render a decision once the application is deemed complete. If council fails to do so, the application is deemed to have been approved. Finally, before we get into questions and comments, I wanted to note that this is the first of several orientation sessions, which should hopefully bring everyone up to speed with the expectations and mandate of the committee, as well as potential other working groups, etc. Further, staff have also prepared 2 resources which will be provided via email after this presentation. The first is a collection of commonly used architectural terms that Nikki referenced earlier, and a step-by-step PDF on how to provide committee comments via Dash, because that is very challenging at times. Finally, we will be holding open meetings for the public in the committee to join staff in the Heritage Resource Center each Wednesday, starting next week at 1 p.m. to discuss recent heritage permit applications. This is an opportunity to provide feedback to staff and the applicant in an informal environment to help guide their application. Further information on the roundtable will be emailed along with the 2 previously noted resources, hopefully by the end of today. And with that, thank you very much, and any questions or comments, we'd be more than willing to help assist you as best we can. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Jennifer, Ryan, Philip, and Nikki, I appreciate the orientation. As you can see, committee members, it's a great deal of detail that we'll be going through, but we have a great team here. So with that, though, I'm going to open the floor for questions from the committee regarding the presentation. So is there anyone who would like to ask a question of staff? Okay, Gunnar?
Who in this entire organization is considered to be the expert in matters of construction, building materials, building life, etc.?
Thank you, and through you, Madam Chair. I wouldn't suggest that there is one person in the city who is the expert on construction matters, but we do take a very strong team approach when we have matters of construction before us. So we do have the opportunity to work with building services, a department separate from our own. Many of the conditions you'll see on our permit will require that there be a permit issued through the building process. That's where we're looking actually for compliance for more sort of structural engineering considerations, health and safety, and the like. We ourselves are more in the vein of experts on the style and the composition of a heritage structure. We are not structural engineers. We are not here to assess in that regard, and it is important to note that distinction. Sometimes you will see us ask for the recommendation of a qualified professional. That is when the city itself does not house in-house an individual who has the capacity to make a specific structural assessment. And so we would require the applicant, and at times, from the direction of council, we have acquired our own opinion through a qualified professional if we feel it necessary. So we sort of, not in an attempt to dodge the question in any way, Gunnar, because I think it's a valid one, but I guess what I'm pointing out here is, depending on the nature of the application, we assemble the team of expertise that is required to address it. And if we don't have the right technical expertise within the city, we essentially find it outside of the city, and we work with then those qualified professionals to bring the information forward. Thanks.
Do you have any other questions? And there's a 5-minute time limit for each person, but we can go through a second round. So Gunnar, I think you still have a little bit more time left.
Thank you. It's generally considered that the Canadian building code system is flawed in that we do not have a building police. And in reviewing the files, 2 of the files that will come up after this session, there are some questions I have that are related to the assurance that the work will be carried out properly. And the other one is, what is being presented is simply not approvable from a point of view of practicality, life expectancy, and durability. Would it be appropriate at those times to discuss them, or should we discuss them now? So I'm troubled.
So just for clarification, are you referring to matters that are on today's agenda?
They are on the agenda.
Okay, so we will discuss them when we get to those items. I think that would be a more appropriate place to have that part of the discussion. Ms. Campbell, do you have any further comments, though, on the construction and any of those sorts of issues?
Thank you, and through you, I think I would just remind the committee, it is challenging at times to sort of understand what the role of the committee is in the approvals process. It is not the role of the committee to determine whether or not something is structurally sound. When an applicant makes an application and is required to achieve a building permit, it is the building process that determines whether or not they have the correct technical submissions and that this will actually do what it is intended to do. I hesitate to use the word style, but this is really about the appearance and the alterations of attributes. So to suggest, for example, that we would like to see the windows reinstated as they were historically. It is not for this committee to determine what that reinstatement needs to look like structurally. It is a recommendation around the aesthetic and the impact to the heritage attribute. And I do appreciate there are times when that line can become quite blurry, particularly when we're looking at the removal of attributes and justifications. And that's why we're always looking for a professional, often a licensed, credentialed professional, to make statements such as, this is actually structurally unsafe and cannot continue in the way that it is currently existing. We do not ask committee to make that determination.
Thank you, Ms. Campbell. I'm going to move over to Jane. She had a question, and we can come back.
Great, thanks. Oh, that was a super introduction. I really appreciate it from staff. I know that we talked at the November 22 meeting about a review of the delegated authority list in 2023, including consultation with the new Heritage Properties Committee. So I'm just wondering when that might take place. I'm looking at the bylaw to establish procedural bylaw for permit applications under the Ontario Heritage Act and to delegate the power to consent. I'm just wondering if that's on the table.
Thank you, and through you again. I'm not usually the one who takes all the questions. It's funny, but when we talk about work planning, it's certainly an appropriate question. And you're right, Jane, in November, we did agree and we added that additional clause to the recommendation at the time, saying that we would do some consultation with this committee as well as with members of the public on the delegated authority list that is currently replicated as it was previously with some minor updates coming out of the review group. That being said, we had, at the time of that recommendation, very much anticipated that work happening in 2023. I will be very, very honest. We are currently assessing work plans against the impacts of Bill 23, and we simply do not have enough staff resource to undertake all of the work that we have before us. I don't want to suggest we're not going to start it this year, but I think the thought that it would be comprehensively completed by the end of this year is uncertain at this point, as we continue to figure out how we're going to allocate staff resource to deal with our listed properties, and whether or not we need to move the delegation authority discussion differently, in constellation, if you will, with what needs to happen to get those listed properties protected when we need to.
And so following along with that, I know that we're kind of in the process of reviewing the windows policy, and I'm wondering if we're going to proceed with that and what perhaps the timeline is.
I can start on that one through you, Madam Chair, and maybe Philip, if he has anything additional to add in. We are advancing the Windows policy revisions. They're very far along. Philip's done a wonderful job working with the Heritage Properties Working Group. We've got a lovely draft in process. That's an opportunity actually to point out the correspondence received from the Frontenac Heritage Foundation about an upcoming event to review windows. And we are actually intending to participate and attend that session so that we can also be ears open to what is being shared and what we hear from those community members there. So at this point, I would say we're probably looking somewhere, to be quite honest, just in timelines, we're probably looking in the summer to see something on the windows policy come back to this committee. And just from a procedural standpoint, what will happen is that the policy will come back to the committee for consultation, and then it will move up to council for approval and implementation, but we would bring it here for the committee to review and offer comment on it at that time.
Okay, thank you very much. So does anyone else have questions for this first round? Okay. Seeing none, do any of the members of the committee have any further questions for second round? Gunnar, did you have any other questions for the orientation? You're good. Okay, thank you. All right, so with that being said, Do any members of the public have any questions? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm jumping ahead. Members of the public will have to wait. Okay, so with that said then, we can move on then to item 8 on the agenda, business. So Part A, Kingston Heritage Properties Committee orientations. We've already had the briefing. So are there any further questions from committee? Last chance. Okay, thank you. So there are no pre-consultations. Okay. All right, so now the members of the public can speak to this item.
So if there are any members of the public that wish to speak to this item, which is the first item, 8A, which is the item that staff briefed on, which is the orientation report. We do have 2 members of the public present virtually in Zoom if they would like to raise their virtual hand. Otherwise, if you are a member of the public that wishes to speak to it, just come to one of the chairs over there, and that goes to all the applications later on. I'm seeing no movement, so we can move on.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we have no pre-consultations, no policy development and implementation. So we're on to, under Section 8 business, Stream 2 permits, approval through delegated authority. And so this is with regards to 2312 Princess Street. And so I'm going to ask Mr. Prell to please come up to the podium and introduce the application.
Through you, Madam Chair. Possible, I'm just going to do a brief one, so I'll stay seated this time, but in the future, potentially. Also wanted to say thank you, Jane, for raising the inconsistency in your comment earlier about in the report, so thank you for drawing that attention. So as a quick overview for 2312 Princess Street, which is right next to the Rona on Princess Street, if you're aware of the area, the subject property is designated under Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act, and as such requires consultation with the Heritage Properties Committee prior to council rendering a decision. For Part 4 property alterations, the proposal is judged against the property's heritage attributes, namely the physical elements of the property that reflect and define its heritage value, which are typically detailed in the designation bylaw. For a brief property description, the subject building with the municipal address of 2312 Princess Street is located on the corner of Princess Street and Anderson Drive, opposite the Kingston Gospel Temple. 2312 Princess Street is located along a prominent arterial road, Princess Street, obviously, has limited designated property surrounding it and forms the edge of the Cataraqui Village heritage character area. Its historic land use, built form, and landscape contrasts with the surrounding with its immediate surroundings, so it draws a large amount of attention. The front portico is an important heritage attribute of the property as it emphasizes its previous use as a home, has craftsmanship that reflects its Italian-influenced architecture, and emphasizes the building's symmetry. As a quick overview of the proposed works, the applicant seeks to scrape and repaint all front entrance woodwork associated with the portico, as well as restore the portico via repairing and recreating the columns and associated millwork, as well as the concrete pad via small-scale repairs or, as necessary, like-for-like replacement of select features depending on their condition. In essence, this is a restoration and recreation proposal. The recommendation is that staff recommend approval of the proposed works, subject to the conditions detailed in the recommendation that is included in its entirety in the associated report. With that being said, I'd be more than willing to answer any questions or concerns or thoughts based on this application, and look forward to helping address any of those. Thank you.
Can I just add, Madam Chair, a couple things to what Mr. Prell said. This is what we call a Part 4 application. So as opposed to Part 5, this is an individual designated property. So the committee has the opportunity to amend or approve the motion that's before you. Also, I would note, if for these files that you'll see today, they were circulated to the previous members of the committee. So you may not have fully seen these or been able to comment on them. And that's just a processing transitional thing, I'm afraid. But we're available to answer questions. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So I'm just going to ask if the applicant wishes to make any comments at this point for the committee?
Through you, Madam Chair, the applicant just told me they're not in attendance today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so with that, we're going to move to questions from the committee. So this is not consideration of the motion yet. This is questions regarding the application. So if you have any, please let me know. Okay, Gunnar.
Considering that the scope of this work is entirely within the category of maintenance and repair, why does it come to this committee? I believe it's totally under the scope, under delegated authority, and doesn't really require involvement from this committee. Is that not correct?
So staff?
Through you, Madam Chair, thank you for the question, Gunnar. In this case, a lot of the works would be considered maintenance, I agree. However, based on the potential scale of the works that may be required, such as large-scale replacement and recreation of said materials, especially the recreation of the column bases on the southernmost part of the portico, we believe that it exceeded the maintenance definition in the Heritage Procedural Bylaw based potentially on the scope of the work. And we made that determination partly because a detailed assessment by the applicant was not provided to the full scale that might be necessary. So we wanted to purposely give this permit to cover as much of the basis as possible to give the applicant maximum flexibility to what we think proceed with work that would be considered proper heritage work and would support the restoration of many heritage attributes on this property and make it in such a state where future maintenance should be considered just as maintenance and not require any approval under the Ontario Heritage Act. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Prell. Do you have a further question?
Yes. In view of the fact that there is a great big sign on the site that indicates there's a major project to follow, does this impact on this particular phase? That's one. Two is, I admit to having trespassed the site, and I don't know whether that's permitted or not, but I admit that having been there. The scope of work is more than obvious that it is structural, and at the same time, there's also no evidence that any tree cutting is required with this. Is there something else going on with the site that we do not know and perhaps should know?
Okay, to staff? Okay.
Perhaps I can answer, Madam Chair. As I've been the team's contact for the planning department, this large sign on the property you see is an active planning application. The owner of this property has plans to develop the rear. It's a fairly good-sized property, and they have plans to develop the rear with an apartment-style building. So that is still in the planning review stage and planning approval stage, and it is being assessed and will have further implications that we will be reviewing when the time is right. The work that is before today is simply just to restore the building, which is being retained, as with the mature trees and landscaping on this property, which are very important to its characteristics. So all of that's being retained. So what is before you today is simply a restoration, possible replication of certain features of this porch. And I think that's part of the reason that Mr. Prell mentioned was brought to the committee, is because the owner is not fully, it happens when they're looking at these features, they're not sure what they're getting into. So when they start doing the repairs, there might be further work that's needed. So with that in mind, we wanted to ensure that we fully vetted this one to make sure that what they're proposing will retain the characteristics of this important feature. I hope that answers questions, Madam Chair.
If I could add one more thing as well, Madam Chair, before I yield it back to yourself. In terms of the tree permit, I think that's what you were getting at earlier there, Gunnar. The reason this was done is, as Ryan correctly said, the landscape of the property is also listed in the designation bylaw as something that's critical to the property's importance and understanding, and it's in great contrast to the area surrounding it, so we want to maintain it. And to your point, there's no tree cutting expected, but there is a potential that depending on how construction is done on the property, whether trucks are brought in, whether materials are leaned against these trees, there could be damage to the root systems, there could be damage to the tree trunks, and both of which of those things could have long-term damage to the trees in their life cycles. As a result, we wanted to have an abundance of caution and make sure that the applicant appropriately protected these trees, not necessarily from cutting, but from these potential impacts to lower ground disturbance. This can usually take the form of putting fencing around these trees, or simply notifying the members of the construction crew, please have a wide berth of these trees, or do not drive your trucks in certain areas. So that is the purpose of having this tree permit be involved in this application. Thank you.
Okay. Do you have a further question? Because then I'm going to let someone else have an opportunity. Okay, thank you. Okay. Jane? Oh, sorry. All right. I'm a little short here, so anybody who's behind the screens needs to wave quite high, okay? Any further questions from the committee about the application? Okay, Gunnar, one more.
It does appear that the foundation for that portico is a stone rubble, random placed rubble, and topped with its concrete. The concrete is severely swelled. It is left to the proponent, or at this point, without any controls, to either do a topical repair or a proper repair. We have no controls of it, and I don't believe the city has. And I'm perplexed how to deal with it, because we left it very vague, or the recommendation that it is left to the proponent to choose whichever he wants to do. And what is the objective in undertaking a repair from point of view of the heritage, to maintain that the heritage value will not deteriorate too quickly or basically fall away?
Okay, so staff, and I do believe we're in that fuzzy line area again, but if you could give us some guidance here.
I'm going to start, if I may, Madam Chair. Thank you, and through you. We can only deal with the application of the matter at hand. And to your earlier comment about this seems maintenance, but we as staff had read it and anticipated the potential complexity of the request as they got into the work. And that's why it's here as part of this permit process. I think I would just add that it is not in the nature of our permitting process to dictate specific construction or repair techniques. The permitting process requires then the support, as I mentioned, otherwise. If they were to get into the concrete base and to find it completely unstable and requiring more structural repair than the patching that is approved within the permit, that would have to come back to us for an alteration of the permit approval. So they would then come, and I, as the delegated authority from council, would have the opportunity to say that's in keeping with the spirit of the permit. It is going to protect the heritage attribute as committee and council had approved, and we would allow that to move forward. If the alteration was to then have additional impacts to the attributes, we may actually require a return to committee for a reconsideration of the permit and an alteration of those conditions. I think the other part of this is around property standards and how property standards are managed within the city of Kingston. And there is a property standards bylaw, and the property standards bylaw does also have a section specifically dealing with heritage properties and can require of applicants or individuals, private property owners, to make repairs to their property compliant with that bylaw and considerate of those heritage attributes. Certainly here, we're not in that position. We're in a position where we are asking an applicant to do the work as they've requested in a way that the committee and we can support as staff. If down the line we were to find that this repair was not in keeping with the permit or alternately was in some way challenging the property standards bylaw, we would have other avenues to pursue that discussion after the work had been completed or even while the work was underway. I hope that helps. Thanks.
If I could follow up as well, Madam Chair, before. In addition, and when we circulate these applications, we circulate our building services department. And our building services department also makes comments saying that if any structural work is done, in this case, they specifically commented on the columns, but if they were also talking about the base changes, a building permit would likely be triggered. And as a result, that would be processed accordingly through the Ontario Building Code. And we would be working with the applicant and through the building department to basically confirm that what is put back in place would be either identical to what is there or potentially even more heritage appropriate depending on what is there. Or to Jane McFarland's point that she put in her comments, if there's an actual foundation underneath that isn't concrete. And so we'd be working with the applicant through this process, but the main aspect, I believe, to your question is structurally. That's when we have our building services team who are experts in this process and in the compliance aspect to come in and work with us, and we would try to find a solution, hopefully under the scope of the same permit. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask Jane if you will take the chair for a moment.
Yes.
All you have to do is recognize me and take the chair. Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I just have, by way of quick question of clarification. So with regards to matters of building safety, when a permit comes forward, we consult internally with building services. Is that correct?
Yes, Madam Chair, that is correct. And we would also consult with fire services if necessary for points of ingress, egress, et cetera.
Okay, so we do consult then, obviously, to ensure safety and to ensure that it is properly done, not just from the heritage aspect, but we reach out to the experts within our own team to make sure that that's taken care of.
Yes, that's correct. And that is why we consult with various city departments and we circulate in the same way the committee receives circulations. We have an internal technical circulation. It goes out to more departments than you're actually seeing here. What you see are the responding departments who have raised concerns or those that we circulate always. And building services is one of those groups who always receive our circulations for feedback and input.
Okay, so would it be safe to say then that on an application and on the reports that we receive, if there had been a concern about what was being proceeded with, it would have been noted on there and we would be aware of it?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Okay, back to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Jennifer.
I don't know if this is clarification or where this would fall under, but in speaking to what you were talking about them having various avenues to restore and us not necessarily being able to choose one, I think that what's happened often in the committee before is we can give advice and, the benefits of doing one versus the other, saying that it's going to add longevity to us versus like a quicker fix. I think my understanding would fall under our, what we do.
This is a great discussion, actually, to be having at the first committee meeting, because you're absolutely right, Jen, that the committee can make recommendations and advice. And sometimes when we have the applicant present, you'll see that applicants are very willing to receive those suggestions. That's why we love getting comments through Dash early. It affords us the opportunity to present those to the applicant and have the applicant potentially adjust their approach. So by the time it gets to committee, you can see some of your advice or suggestions alongside of our perception of the application in action. But you are right, you can issue advice here. You can also alter Part 4 recommendations to include something very specific. So for example, if the committee is quite committed that the reinstallation of an attribute needs to include X, you can make that a condition of the application or the permit that you're considering. What's important to know, and this is not in any way to stop you from making those adjustments, but what is important to know is that in our new 3-stream process, if you make a change here at the committee to a Part 4 application, staff then have to assess whether or not it is, in line with how we would have brought forward, and oftentimes changes at committee are supported by staff. So we're usually pretty comfortable. But if the change also then has to be brought back to the applicant. So if the applicant has come forward and said, I'm going to do X, and we bring that forward for committee consideration, we're supportive of what the applicant has brought forward, and committee says, no, we would like to see Y. Then we have to go back to the applicant as well as back to ourselves and say, are we okay with the alteration that was made at committee? If we are and the applicant is, the permit can still be issued under Stream 2. If we are not, and the applicant is not, or either of us are in disagreement essentially in the Stream 2 process, it will go to council, because council is ultimately the decision-making body on this matter. So I just wanted to put that out there. So yes, you can make advice. Yes, you can alter Part 4 recommendations. Different processes will fall out thereafter, depending on how that alteration is received. I hope that helps. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think this has been a great discussion. Are there any further questions from committee? Okay, Alex?
Just to clarify, if there is a conflict between, let's say, the building services or fire services or something and the heritage services, is there a set hierarchy of, this overrules this, or is it kind of we have to triage it or you have to triage it?
Thank you, and through you, Madam Chair. Again, I'm not usually the one who speaks, but we're getting into really good policy stuff that you guys do need to understand as a committee. So it really depends. The building code does make exceptions for heritage properties to not be compliant with standards that are outlined within the building code. An example of that might be the spacing on balustrades, right? So on a staircase, you may have different spacing between those railings or the columns that support them. So Heritage Act would actually somewhat trump in there. Now that depends on the use of the property. If the property is for public consumption versus private, that can change matters. If it's a dormitory at Queen's University and they need windows upgraded to suit dormitory standards, we actually may need to fall under health and safety guidelines. So when we have complex files like that, we do have our chief building officer at the City of Kingston, Lisa Kapner-Hunt, who leads the building services team, and she does have the authority to work with me to determine, kind of who goes first, if you will. The greatest emphasis is always on public safety and health. And then secondarily, it is on the heritage attributes, with a reasonable understanding that some older things do not come into compliance with modern kind of building standards or codes. So we are sort of negotiating that, if you will. So if we were to bring a heritage application forward, just hypothetically so you can see it kind of work through the process, if we had an application that we then submitted to the building services team and they said, not only does this require a building permit, but there's a health and safety concern here, we, before bringing it to committee, would have had that internal dialogue with that department to determine what the right recommendation would be. And if we are seeing a call from building that requires us to make an allowance for health and safety, we had one of these actually just at the end of the last term of committee, where we had an alteration with some fire access on the exterior of the building, and part of the committee's recommendation that this group would have received said, these are absolutely not in keeping with the heritage approach, but these are required for this building to continue to be used. And so we will allow them. We're trying to get them to look as nice as we can, but we want them obviously to meet that health and safety standard. So again, it's not a cut and dry answer. It is a negotiation in almost all discussions. But yes, we do have an internal process by which we ensure what the committee receives is something heritage can support, and building has at least flagged that it can support in concept through the building permit process.
If I could add one thing as well, in the reports right at the conclusion section, we purposely have a statement there that says no concerns have been raised by internal departments. And so I just wanted to flag that where if there are any concerns in the future of has this been vetted or not, we do make sure that we explicitly note that in the report section. So just so there's no ambiguity. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that's going to help us as we move forward as a new committee to understand the processes internally. Are there any last questions from committee before I move to public questions and comments? Okay, seeing none, so I'm going to open this up to the public. Are there any questions or comments from the public regarding this application? If there are, just note that you have 5 minutes.
I am not seeing any movement, Madam Chair.
Okay, so seeing none, I'm going to move to the motion, and I'm going to ask for a mover and a seconder to put the motion on the floor to approve this application. Okay, Jennifer, Jane. All right, so now I'm going to go to committee. Are there any other questions or comments now with regards to the motion? Okay, seeing none, I'm going to call the vote. So all those in favor of the application? Okay, and that's passed. All right, so we are on to our next order of business. Okay. So stream 3 permits, approval through council authority. So this is going to be a discussion regarding 61 Baden Street. So I'm going to ask Brian to introduce this, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to confuse the committee completely, we are introducing this file to you, which is not a stream 3. It is something different altogether that even some of the more veteran members of this committee may have only seen once or twice in their tenure. This property at 61 Baden Street is a non-designated heritage property that is believed to be of cultural heritage value. That's also known as a listed property. Listed properties are added to the register through Section 27 of the Heritage Act, which is Part 4, and they are added as a form of, traditionally, a form of inventorying resources that council believes, quote unquote, have heritage value. So this property was added as a listed property in 2010, and the owners of these properties are not obliged to get heritage approvals, heritage permits for changes to their properties. However, when they wish to demolish the property, they need to give council notice. And so what is before you today is what we call a notice of demolition. And a notice of demolition is served on the city and on council specifically. And the council gets 60 days from when they receive that notice to determine if the property warrants a full designation. The only avenue to stop the demolition is to serve what's called a notice of intent to designate. So it's the first step in a designation process. And in doing so, would void the demolition permit. A demolition permit application has already been submitted for this site. So as part of council's consideration of this notice, we bring these to this group, to the Heritage Properties Group, to look at the merits of this property as it stands against the criteria in the Heritage Act for designating a site and determine if it warrants advancing a notice of intent to designate to stop the demolition. So the property that's before you today, I probably confused you completely, but let's go back to the actual application. The property before you today is at 61 Baden Street. It's on the west end of the Portsmouth Village character area between McDonald and Mowat Streets on the north side. It contains a circa 1860s 1.5-story frame dwelling and a garage that was built in the 1920s. As I said, it was added to the register in 2010 as a listed property, and the agent for the owner has provided an application to request demolition of this building, to give us notice of demolition. They've included photos of the building. They hosted a site tour of the building where some of the members attended. They also provided a heritage assessment prepared by Mac Jervin and Associates, and a condition assessment prepared by carpenter Peter Whitmore, as all part of their application. And as I mentioned, a demolition permit has also been submitted through our building staff and building department. And the applicant and current owner are here in attendance to answer questions. So staff, in our role, have assessed this application. We toured the property, looked through the condition assessment. The property is in poor condition, to say the least. It is staff's recommendation that council receive the notice of intent to demolish and take no further action towards designation. Given the advanced stage of deterioration of this building, very little of the original heritage attributes can be retained or restored. If they're to be restored, they would be replicas. So you'd have a replica building sitting there. Because in accordance with the structural assessment, the mold is pretty prevalent in this building and the rot is pretty prevalent, I'm afraid. If well maintained, when we look at the conditions, the criteria in what's called Ontario Regulation 906, which we'll get into at further training in the future, on when you determine if a property has heritage value. If well maintained, this property could meet a couple of the criteria, which are it could be considered a good example of a simple vernacular building from the mid-19th century that contributes to the heritage character of the village. However, there are other examples of these types of buildings in the area that are in better condition. And as I mentioned, the poor condition of the building renders the remaining value has been pretty negatively compromised. So staff further recommend as part of this motion that the property be removed from the register as a listed property. And we're available for comments and questions because this is a bit of a tough one. Thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Yes, this is going to be a bit of a difficult one for us all. Right now, I'm going to ask if the applicant would like to comment.
Please come to one of the microphones.
Okay, and please state your name. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Matt Gervin. I'm a designer and builder and have been involved with Heritage for many years. Just before I begin, I'd just like to say I'm really glad to see the reorientation of this committee, now called the Heritage Properties Committee. I was on the committee for 9 years back in the late 80s and 90s, and I was on 7 or 8 years up till just the past few years ago. So I've been through a lot of different iterations of this committee and how it's gone. And I think coming back to this forum of just for Heritage Built and this idea of the round table on Wednesdays where we can actually sit with the clients and you guys can actually give the advice that we actually want. You know, we used to be called the Local Architectural Conservation Advisory Committee, so we can advise the owners. I think is really a good turn in the right direction, so I'm really pleased to see that. But getting to this building, I'm certainly interested in saving buildings when we can, but this one's really in incredibly bad shape. It's not even in the old part of the village. It's in, you know, sort of it's north of King Street. The only thing that was noted in the listing description of the building was the board and batten siding. Since then, presumably the battens were taken off. The boards are probably in behind, but there's been aluminum siding put on top of it. Then that was removed, and then styrofoam and stucco put on top of it. So any boards that would be there would be filled with lots of nail holes, and I don't think it would really be appropriate. The back addition, you know, and I know this building was, one of the questions was, is this building important because of who it was built for? And I believe this is built for someone who was working in the penitentiary. And as you know, back in the old days, if you worked at the penitentiary, you had to live close enough so that you could hear the bell ring in case there's an emergency at the penitentiary. So that's why there's so many of these small little buildings built in the Portsmouth area, so that if something happened in the penitentiary, there's a riot or something, they could ring the bell, and you would, you know, there's no telephones back then, and no internet, and to get people to the site. So there actually are many buildings built on this basis, not just this one. And there's lots of that don't look that modest now because they've had additions put on the back, and there's an addition built on the back of this one, and it sort of sits in the mud in the back and is in bad shape. So I think that I certainly agree with the staff recommendation to allow this building to go forward and be demolished. And I'd be happy to answer any questions if anyone has any. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So with that, I'm going to ask for questions from the committee on the application. So this is just questions at this point. Okay, Anne?
I'm very curious, when a building is voted to be demolished, is any of the material that is done, is it like some of it may be used elsewhere in other people's, like industrial salvage sort of thing? And would there ever be any archaeology done on when a building is torn down? Thank you.
Okay, staff? Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good questions. If the building had salvageable materials, that's certainly something we would have suggested to the owners. It's unusual to put conditions on these type of recommendations. I question whether we have the ability to actually do that. But certainly if there were features in the building that or materials on the building that were worth salvaging, we certainly would have mentioned that to them. I fear in this case there probably isn't. And your second part of your question, absolutely. Yes, archaeology, I believe, is going to be part of a Planning Act complete application. So I think we've already mentioned that to them through that process.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman.
Jennifer, and then Jane.
Has the Working Properties Group made any comment on this or come through it? No? All right.
I think through you, Madam Chair, I'm not entirely sure what the member's referring to as far as the committee there. There's the Heritage Properties Working Group, which these matters don't typically go through. And we are starting a Heritage Permit Roundtable committee meetings, which don't actually start until next week. So the answer is no, neither of those groups have seen this.
Okay. Jane?
I wanted to follow up on what Anne had said about the windows, and I'm thinking about the windows policy in these windows, and we only consider replacement when a period of window is so deteriorated that even if repaired, very little would remain. So I want to put it out there that perhaps these old growth period windows should be considered or expected to be retained and repurposed for use on other rehabilitation projects. I hate to see anything old growth go in the dumpster, so that's my first question.
Okay, comment from staff?
I can take that, thank you, and through you, Madam Chair. It's really challenging, Jane, we're with you, right? We would love to see old growth windows, even on a property that will be demolished, to be retained, potentially for even sale or use elsewhere in the city where they might be able to do so. Unfortunately, we don't have a permitting process through this recommendation clause to require that, and even more so because this is a listed property only, and so our control is really only whether we want to issue a notice of intent to designate, or alternately, do we want to essentially stand down, allow the property to be demolished, and therefore be delisted in that process. So it's a recommendation to the applicant and to the representative. We would certainly encourage them to consider, if there's benefit or an opportunity to retain any of these elements, but we have no mechanism to require it.
Okay, yes, I would appeal to the applicant, but there you go. And my other question was, I'm reading into this, but I think the intent of the demolition is to develop the large lot to support more housing. So given the size of the lot, was there any consideration given to rehabilitating the building to preserve the streetscape and then locating a new building in the open areas of the lot? So that's a question, I guess, for the applicant.
So the applicant, if you'd like to respond to both questions with the recommendation to
Sure.
see if you can preserve and...
I'm not really privy to what the new owners are planning to do with the property. We're here sort of representing the existing owner who's trying to sell the property because she needs to sell it. And but I think was your question that could we save that building and then build a new building beside it? Is that what you're asking?
Do you want to reiterate your question, Jane?
Sure, yes. So it's a really big lot. If we saved the building, it would preserve the streetscape or the aspect of streetscape along Baden Street. And you could develop that lot. There's tons of room on it when you look at the site plan. So we'd be, saving a building with old growth lumber and also, bringing forth the development. And I wondered if that was considered. Perhaps I don't really know the whole situation there, but I just wanted to put that out there. Has that been discussed or will it be discussed? It can't be if the building's demolished, so the new owner will not have the opportunity to consider that, I guess.
Well, it's the new owners who would be demolishing it. It isn't the existing owner. The existing owner is just selling the property as it is, so they would have that opportunity. But I would think that, the building really cannot be saved. I'm sorry, I've been involved with a lot of buildings and I've restored many, many buildings over the years, but that one is just, it's way beyond the abyss, and trying to then build something larger beside it would kind of dwarf the situation, and we'd have to go through severance to divide the property up and all kinds of complicated things like that. So, it's really up to the new owners. I've never met them. I don't know what their plans are. But I really don't think this building can really be realistically be restored.
Okay, thank you. Are there any further questions? Gunnar?
Slow learner. I've reviewed the file, and it leads to a number of questions. First of all I'm perplexed that only 3 out of 7 committee members reviewed and issued reports, where the other 4. And how does the department deal with this when it itself has not provided a counter argument for or against the demolition? You see, Baden Street and that section is a pretty blah street. And this building happens to be the only one of 3 buildings, heritage or older buildings, that truly have a character that provides a very pleasant view for that street. Removing that robs the other neighbors of that pastiche, that element that makes the street special. I think we owe the other neighbors something in preserving something.
Gunnar, I'm just going to ask you.
I'm not finished yet.
Oh, you'll have opportunity to
I'm
comment.
leading to it. Yes, okay.
This is for questions. So do you have a question to ask right now? And when we move the motion, you'll have
You can
opportunity
answer that,
to
and
comment.
I'll answer that. Yes.
So can you just reiterate your question to staff?
It appears to me that to remove a building, to demolish it, without having an adequate replacement, a design of an adequate replacement there, we're not doing our job. And I believe that the previous committee did not do its job. And perhaps my question is, if you have a minority with a same decision not to retain, not the others, I think the other 4 should have been compelled to issue a report, which wasn't done. And I don't believe the city has provided an adequate case to support or to provide a counter argument against demolition. And please answer that.
Okay, so I'm going to refer this to staff, but I am going to quickly comment. So I attended on site, and through this committee, members of previous committee also can bring that verbally to this discussion. Okay, so just as a point of clarification. But I'll move to staff to make a comment on the process, because I think that's really what this is about.
Thank you, and through you. I'm going to do my best to address this, and I apologize, Mr. Gunnar. Mr. Heisler, if you could speak into your mic a little bit closer. We're having a little bit of a hard time hearing you over here, and I just want to make sure that we are catching everything that you're sharing moving forward. But if I may, I think there are a couple of pieces here, and I think you're right, Madam Chair. When a listed property comes forward with a demolition request, the question before committee is not what will happen once the demo is complete. It's not, could there be a new building built in its place that would be more appropriate to the neighborhood? The question and the decision before us is, do we stop the demolition by issuing a notice of intent to designate? A notice of intent to designate right now under Bill 23's changes to the Ontario Heritage Act requires that we meet a number of the 906 criteria for this property. One of the things that staff did when they received this application is we looked at the criteria that would be required to be met to move forward a notice of intent to designate. The question we were asking was, is there enough here to advance a notice that would uphold on appeal? That is our technical need as staff, is to recommend to council things that we believe should be upheld and would be successfully upheld beyond. Our assessment of this property, as represented in the report, says no. We do not have necessary criteria that staff justifiably and professionally feel would be the right recommendation to council to move this property to conservation. So because our answer to the notice of intent to designate is no, the de facto then is we are essentially then doing nothing and therefore allowing the demolition process to proceed. We, again, have no legislative control on what will happen on the property thereafter. If the property was designated and upheld through this 906 consideration, we would then have opportunity to consider things. We also have opportunity to consider the character of the neighborhood when we have designated properties, when we have character areas that have designated properties within them. Again, this is Portsmouth Heritage Character Area. However, the property is not designated. And so again, we end up back in this. The primary question here is, does the property warrant conservation and preservation through issuing a notice of intent to designate? I think there's a very good rationale provided through the report and through the supporting documentation that has been issued as to why staff do not feel that we could recommend to council that this property be designated and that that designation would stand moving forward if it were to be appealed.
Thank you, Ms. Campbell. So are there any other questions? Just noting that you will get another opportunity to comment and ask questions once the motion is moved. Okay, Gunnar? And just move your mic closer so that we can hear you a little more clearly.
Does council have the power or the option to make the a demolition permit, if it were to be granted, conditional, that the replacement building would satisfy this committee, the Heritage Department?
Thank you, and through you, no, we do not have the authority for a listed property to make conditions on the demolition. If the property were designated, we might have an alternate route to consider the impacts of that through, a detailed heritage impact statement, a proposal for conservation or rehabilitation of the site, et cetera. The process moving forward, if the demolition were to occur and development by a new owner were to be pursued, would be a Planning Act application, which would then be reviewed through a planning process. And could, offer consideration of how many properties might exist on the site, what's the appropriate setbacks, et cetera. But those would be managed through the planning process at that time.
Thank you. Any other questions on the application? Okay. So with that, I'm going to open the floor to the public for questions and comments on the application.
I see one hand in the virtual. Oh, yes, there we go. Shirley Bailey.
Okay, Shirley, would you like to bring forward your questions or comments, please?
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Welcome to the new committee members. It's been very interesting to listen to all the questions and answers this morning, and I really appreciate the fact that we've got a whole bunch of brand new committee members, and it's really great to see the detail that you're getting into. I think, as Ryan pointed out, this is a tough one, right? Because Ryan will know that, and it's included in the report, that Jennifer McKendry had done a review of the Portsmouth Heritage Character Area, as you might call it, with the thought that it might become a heritage district, and this work was done several years ago. So it's hard to see a property that she considered at the time to be significant to now see, I guess we're dealing with an issue of demolition by neglect, by mold, by rot. It's really sad to see what could have been saved in such poor condition. I'm very, very pleased to hear, however, that committee members and staff were able to do a site visit. And this is such a critical part of the work that you will do, is to see with your own eyes the conditions that are in place. Mac Gervin has spoken, and Mac, we know, I mean, we certainly know we've given Mac awards over the years. He's a reputable expert on construction and heritage redevelopment. But in this case, he is working for the owner, the existing owner. And, we're looking at a situation, as the staff have mentioned, that there are 300 listed properties, which will need to be reviewed over the next couple of years. And this is a really challenging prospect, I must say. So here you have a situation, we believe, at the foundation where a qualified personnel or professional should be brought in by the city to make a determination on these things. I think Ryan Leary will remember, I'm sorry, I tried to find on the city's website last night the staff report, but it seemed to me that there was a demolition on Green Bay Road in Berryfield some years ago where a qualified professional was brought in to provide a sort of arm's length evaluation, if you like, of whether or not the building should be kept. And that, I think, if we're looking at, I mean, we recognize, the foundation recognizes that Kingston wants more housing, we need more housing, and the new council certainly is thinking along those lines. So we need to exercise great caution, we believe, in terms of how such requests are going to be evaluated over time. So we appreciate the conversation that's happening. This is a challenging piece of the work that you will be doing. Not having seen the building, we can't really comment in terms of whether it's worth keeping or not, but it is a very tough question that you're dealing with this morning. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Bailey. Those comments are much appreciated. Is there anyone else from the public who would like to ask a question or provide comment? So just approach the microphone and state your name. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Rod White. I'm the agent for the owner, Nina Lewis, excuse me. We wanted to be as transparent as possible, and that's why we encouraged and invited everyone on the Heritage Committee for a site visit. The intent was to objectively look at whether this house could be saved, and that's why I brought a separate contractor, separate from Mac Gervin, for a second site visit, and that was submitted to Dash, his comments, and essentially his comments as a licensed carpenter was that the house was too far gone to be saved, and he went point by point in his letter that I submitted. I think because the house was hammered with metal meshing, that the stucco was then attached to all the wood siding is damaged with nail holes and metal siding, and the house is so rotten and so moldy that it's really beyond saving. That was just the main point I wanted to make.
Thank you, Mr. White. It's much appreciated, and thank you for being so transparent with the site visits. Are there any further comments or questions from the public?
I see no further movement, Madam Chair.
Okay, so seeing none, we're going to move to the recommendation. So the recommendation is that this Kingston Heritage Properties Committee recommends to Council that the notice of intention to demolish at 61 Baden Street be received and no further action be taken, and that the listed status of the property at 61 Baden Street be removed from the City of Kingston Heritage Register pursuant to Section 27 of the Ontario Heritage Act. So I'm going to ask for someone to move and someone to second. Okay, Alex, and a seconder. Anne, thank you. Okay, so now I'm going to go to the committee for any further comments or questions at this time. Jennifer?
I was wondering about the cultural heritage analysis. So my understanding from reading through this is that it has to meet 2 criteria. Improve, okay, awesome. Yeah, I guess I just, like, honestly, having, like, seen properties come through and me wondering, oh, why is that actually getting designated? And then looking at this one and being like, oh, I could see why this is getting designated. I guess I just, like, so there's what, 9 points? Yeah, okay. And then, so like having the guard having lived there is like the contextual one. I guess just like its contribution to like the area, that's like a totally different point, or is that just like you don't think it would qualify under that?
Through you, Madam Chair. I'm afraid we didn't get into the details of the 906 criteria, but indeed there are 9, and they used to be, until very recently, broken into 3 larger categories. When we drafted this report, separated them into those broader categories for clarity and ease of understanding. So the first 3 criteria have to do with the physical design of the building. Is it a good example of a type of building, style, material, that type of thing? Is it a rare or unique example of a building? Is it demonstrate high degree of craftsmanship or some sort of scientific achievement? Those are the things you look for in the physical design, first 3 categories. The next 3 categories have to do with their historical and associative values. So as Dr. Campbell mentioned, those intangible features. Does the building tell us something about, was it a part of an event, or did someone of an interest live there, or was something, does it have an association with an architect perhaps that designed this building? Is it a good example of their work? Those type of things that we look at from a historical perspective. The third grouping, the last 3 criteria, have to do with its, as the member mentioned, its contextual value. So what it contributes to the broader community. Is it a landmark? That's one of the big tests in that section. Does it help us understand a former use or a former complex of buildings in that area? Or does it help contribute to the characteristics of that streetscape or that area? So those are the 9 broad criteria that we have to look at. And indeed, with the new changes to the Heritage Act, a designated property has to meet at least 2 of those 9. And in our analysis, we found that it did not. Possibly, if it were in good condition, it could be part of that last section of the contributing to the characteristics of the streetscape, that type of thing. But there are other buildings in the district that do it just as well, in our opinion, which is why this area has been looked at as a district. There are a lot of contributing buildings that help keep that characteristic of that area and that village. So I think our analysis is pretty complete there, and explains all of those 9 criterias. I hope I answered your question. We can answer more, of course.
Thank you for that. Anything further, Jennifer? Okay. Does anyone else have a question or a comment? Alex?
Just following up on that. So if a property is so severely deteriorated that you don't feel that it could be restored, does it make that whole analysis moot on the 9 criteria, or is it more a question of the more criteria it makes, how much effort do we want to take to restore it, or is it just this property is too far gone, we're not even going to make this analysis?
It's, through you, Madam Chair, it really is a case-by-case, resource-by-resource analysis. No 2 properties are exactly the same. No 2 characteristics or context are exactly the same. In this particular case, yes, the condition played a big factor. If you want to hold it up as a good example of a 19th century working class frame building, you'd want to have one that is a shining example, that has a lot of its authenticity, a lot of its original features. You'd want, or alternatively, if you don't, you'd want one that's rare. You'd want one that's the only one left. And when we looked at that, to restore this building, in our opinion, and the opinion of the carpenter, and also Mr. Jervin, I believe, if they were to restore that building, there's not much of those existing features that can be kept. So the restoration would end up being a replication. And if you're going to hold it up as an example of a good building, in this particular case, and it's a replica, they don't really go hand in hand. It's sort of defeating the purpose, in our opinion, and not meeting that test. So condition did play a big factor in this particular analysis, but doesn't always.
If I may, and through you, Madam Chair, I would just add to that, a designation cannot require a restoration. So the designation consideration has to look at what's extant. So even though we know this used to be a board and batten and it was taken down in '73, we cannot designate it based on something that isn't there any longer on information of what used to be there. Because we cannot, through the Ontario Heritage Act, require the restoration or reconstruction of absent elements. We can certainly bring them forward in consideration when people want to do things, but one thing this committee will continue to see throughout your term is we will have opportunity where perhaps there is a modern window in an old building, and we would like to see a reproduction nice window go in place. But under the Ontario Heritage Act, they are allowed to replace it like for like. And so right now, if we were to designate this property based on absent things that used to be there that we're sad we don't have anymore, because we are, we would not have any grounds to require a reinstallation of board and batten on this property, though we could make a suggestion to do so if it were designated.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions or comments, Alex? Okay. Does anyone else on the committee? Gunnar, and then Al, and next.
It appears that we, as committee members, are not bound by the act. And we are, as committee members, perhaps the only people that can save a heritage element that makes a street of character or a blah street. So it's up to us to act. Is that correct?
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you, and through you. I just want to caveat that, yes, the committee's job is to represent the opinion of community, and if the opinion of community was that there is a preference to see this property designated, you certainly have the opportunity to vote down the recommendation that is before you. I would, however, additionally add that it is not the decision of this committee on whether or not the property would advance to designation. It is the decision and the authority held only by council through the Ontario Heritage Act. And so this committee could choose, if you would rather see the property be considered for designation, your option would be to vote against the recommendation that is on the floor in front of you. And then council would receive that recommendation of staff that had been not supported by committee. And council would then have the opportunity to determine whether or not they would like to issue a notice of intent to designate or direct staff to do so, or alternately to, accept the recommendation that staff have written based on their professional assessment. Thank you.
Does that clarify that for you, Gunnar? That you're, okay. Anne?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I've read the report and looked at all the documentation that was sent. I'm just really sad that this is a really good example of demolition by neglect. However, I think there's enough experts that have analyzed this property and looked at its attributes historically, and I would support the demolition as it stands. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Jane?
From a heritage preservation perspective, supporting demolition because a building has been left to seriously deteriorate, whatever the reasons, I feel it sets a precedent that demolition approval of listed properties could be facilitated by allowing a significant property to deteriorate. I am concerned about that. I would hope too that we as a community have learned much about heritage conservation since the 1970s when this particular property was compromised but not demolished. If indeed we are serious about taking action against climate change, we need to support rehabilitation and repurposing and not demolition of existing buildings. and especially those that contain precious old growth. I really appreciate staff for clarifying and explaining all of this. I think the dialogue has been really excellent. I think it's a very difficult decision, but I would like to say that I am not going to support this recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. And Jennifer?
I guess I was wondering, like, if this was a designated building versus the gray area that it's in, how this would be different as maybe a way to better understand. Does that make sense?
Good question, Madam Chair. The difference would be that the owner would be seeking council's approval to demolish the building. As a designated property, there's a little more of a test you'd have to look at the merits of supporting the removal of a designated building. So yes, it would be a tougher test. It would be a different question, I think. As the director mentioned, today the question before us is, does this building warrant designation? That's really all we can do at this point. So it's a different train of thought, and frankly one that we haven't really put our mind to at this point, because that's a tough one.
Jennifer, did you have another question before I move back?
More just a follow-up, but I guess I see that if we get listed, if it, say, goes through the listed process, and then they're just applying for demolition of a listed property under, so if this, yeah, I guess that the futility of putting that designation only for it to come back, and like what sort of extra stringent things would it come back? That was kind of where I was going.
I'll take this one, Madam Chair, thank you. It's very interesting in this moment. The property was listed under different guidelines in a different moment in heritage conservation. And, I reference Ms. McFarland's earlier comment about, 1970s heritage conservation and consideration is very different from where we're at in the world today. And I say that because one of the reasons why Bill 23 is asking us to revisit our listings, whether we're comfortable with that or not, is to actually challenge the role of a listing. A listing under now the new provisions and guidelines of legislation is to indicate that there is a significant reason to consider that there's cultural heritage value within a property, and to establish a timeline by which that has to be moved to designation. Our old listings allowed us a greater amount of levity. We were able to say this property might have some value and we're not quite there and we're not really going to do anything with it yet. We just want control if it comes in for demo. So that being said, if the property were to be designated, if you were to decline the recommendation, it goes up to council, council were to come back with a recommendation to staff to issue a notice of intent to designate, what would that look like? We'd enter an appeals process. There would be an opportunity for the property owner to appeal the notice of intent to designate. If that was upheld by the Ontario Land Tribunal, if the notice was upheld and the designation was considered to have been enacted, we would then see likely the possibility, if there was development proposed on the site, there'd be a development application, which would include some of the things that were mentioned by other committee members. Is there an opportunity to rehabilitate? We'd probably see the same engineering reports and considerations from experts saying that there isn't. We'd see a request then to remove the designation in service to a development application, et cetera. And we may end up at the same place yet again. So that would be kind of what next steps might include. But, again, to Ryan's earlier comment, I think the key piece here for committee, and it's very challenging when we know we're in a moment of transition with the Ontario Heritage Act, but really the question before committee, does this property warrant a designation? Period. Not based on what it used to look like, what it looks like today. Does it warrant a designation? That was the question staff wrote the report to speak to. We feel it does not. Certainly the committee can feel differently.
Thank you, Ms. Campbell. Now I know Anne has another question. Technically, when we move to this part of the agenda, you get one opportunity to speak, but because of the sensitivity of this and that we're new, I will allow you to comment again, okay?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Again, my major concern, as this has been demolition by neglect, I never vote for any demolition with an easy mind. Can the property owners of the building be required to, especially with respect to the old growth wood that is in this building, can they be required to inventory the demolition to make certain any particular architectural elements could be saved or reused somewhere else?
Okay, so staff, if you could comment on that, because I know we're in a unique situation where the property is being sold and it's the potential new owner that would be undertaking the demolition. So just some clarification on the next steps should this move ahead.
Thank you, and through you, no, we do not have a process under the Ontario Heritage Act to require conditions of demolition on a listed property. Should the property have been designated in the past, passing those criteria that we don't feel we do, we might have had an opportunity then. There are examples of demolition within the city that were allowed on designated properties where we did have conditions for the demolition. And also conditions on the redevelopment, so that the property was not simply removed and a vacant space then created that was never infilled. But again, with a listed property, the discussion is really, do we designate or don't we? We cannot condition the demolition.
So Jane, I'm going to ask you to take the chair again for a moment.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So just to add some extra clarification to this, so the demolition permit is to demolish the house only, correct?
No, Madam Chair, it's the house and the little detached garage. It's the house was from the 1860s and the little garage from the 1920s. They're both.
Okay, but not to demolish any of the trees or any other things on the property?
The application under this part of the Heritage Act is strictly for this building, these buildings.
Okay, and so another question then to staff. So if this demolition happens and the new owner moves forward to planning and building, there will be consideration then for the other features on the property, correct?
Good question, Madam Chair. Likely, a future redevelopment of this site will require a number of Planning Act applications. There are certain avenues for requiring the placement and scale of those buildings. The design, given where it is, could be subject to heritage considerations, given it's adjacent to heritage resources and in a character area. But all those are yet to come, and we don't know fully what the new owners have in mind. But I would hazard a guess that yes, there will be opportunities to look at characteristics moving forward.
Okay, so thank you very much for that. I just wanted clarification that we're not approving the trees. It is for the building structures on site, and then should the new owners, again, this is contingent on things moving forward, they would have to go through a full planning process where there would be consideration for the other elements at that particular moment in time. I visited the site, and it is in severe disrepair. You know, I don't take this lightly. I was shocked at the condition. So although I did not provide a written comment, I did attend on site to see what was being spoken about. And I think from my perspective, this is a wise move. I take the recommendation quite seriously. It's heartbreaking to see this happen. I grew up in a heritage home. My grandparents had a heritage home in another community that was torn down unnecessarily, so I don't take any of this lightly. But I'm just putting forward that that's my thoughts on the matter at this particular moment in time. Thank you very much.
Back to you, Madam Chair.
Okay, so Anne, I will allow you one last comment, and then I'm going to have to call the vote.
I am so sorry for this. I'm a little confused about, will the property value of this real estate sale depend on the demolition? Like, is this affecting the property sale one way or the other? Because I'm just confused about whether the new owners, the current owners, have they sold the property, or is this a condition of the sale?
And I'll recognize you over there. Thank you. Applicant?
So I was acting as the realtor for the owner, for Nina Lewis, who unfortunately has to leave because of her health challenges. But to answer your question, we felt when we were selling the property that the property was beyond salvage. The person who has submitted an offer is only interested in buying the property if they can redevelop it. They are aware that the planning process is going to take at least a year and possibly longer, and they are going to hire a planning firm to help them navigate the process of getting proper planning approval to build something. They don't know they don't have definitive plans, but they're hoping to build a low-rise, 2 or 3 stories of apartments, but nothing's definitive. But suffice to say, unfortunately, 2 days after we agreed to sell the property, we then discovered that the property was listed. So I had gone twice to the planning department for direction and advice on what might be built there, and the planning department advised me that we can't give you any definitive direction on what might be approved until you submit an approval, and that process is very lengthy and detailed, and it's going to take a year to 2 to find out what you can be approved to build. So the buyers who successfully bought the property or submitted an offer have done so with the intent that it's going to take a year or 2 to find out what they can get approved to build. But now, after the fact, once we discovered that it was listed and the demolition approval is not definitive, they said we will not proceed with buying the property if we cannot demolish the old moldy house. To address your question, the value would probably be half if the house has to be restored. And calling it restored wouldn't be, I think it would be the proper term. It has to be completely rebuilt as a reproduction, because the contractor visit, Peter Whitmore, said there wasn't anything of value that could be saved in his report that I submitted to Dash. So I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so with that, I'm actually going to call the vote at this point in time. So all those in favor of the recommendation before us? Okay, and Councillor Osterhoff is no longer? Okay, so that passes. So thank you for all of the comments and the discussion. I know that was one of the most difficult conversations, and certainly a trial by fire as a new committee.
We do that process during council just because of most members that are potentially at council can't see. However, since most of the people that were participating in the discussion were in chamber, we don't necessarily have to state if who's in the minority.
We do record that, though.
Through you, Madam Chair, on the minutes of advisory committees, we do not record if the recorded vote. We just say passed or carried or not carried.
Okay, thank you. All right, so the next matter before us is the application for Ontario Heritage Act approval for 199 Earl Street. So I'm going to ask Nikki to please present the application. Thank you.
Thank you, through Madam Chair. The subject property for this application has the municipal address of 199 Earl Street. It is designated under both Part 4 and 5 of the Ontario Heritage Act and is within the Old Sydenham Heritage Conservation District. In this kind of situation, having both Part 4 and 5 designations, the process that we will be following is Part 5. And your role today as the Heritage Properties Committee is to either endorse or not endorse the staff's recommendation. Any comments that we receive that are offered here today as well as the comments that we previously received through Dash will be provided to the council. The subject property is located mid-block between Berry Street and Clergy Street East on the north side of Earl Street, right across the street from the Chalmers United Church. An application for alteration under Section 42 of the Ontario Heritage Act has been submitted to request approval for the limited demolition and reconstruction of an already existing garage and for the preservation of 2 stone walls that run along the north and west property lines. The property is considered significant to the district, but it is worth mentioning that the garage itself, subject to this application, is not mentioned in either the inventory nor the designation bylaw. The new garage will be constructed on the building footprint of the existing garage. Staff reviewed all the submitted materials as well as applicable policies and the legislations. Overall, the rehabilitation of the existing garage is desirable and it will have a neutral heritage impact. It is not a new structure as the applicant will be rebuilding the non-heritage portions of the already existing garage on the same footprint with the same scale. The stone walls that form the north and west sides of the structure are the key heritage attributes in this application, and conserving these stone walls and, where necessary, repairing and repointing them will further conserve the heritage value of this property. Staff recommends approval of the proposed scope of work, and the full recommendations are within the associated report. I do believe that we have Alex Rose Thompson here today, virtually joining us from beautiful British Columbia, and she is the agent for the property owner, Mr. Dave Wilson.
Thank you, Ms. Kenseth. So I'm now going to ask if the applicant or the representative for the applicant wishes to make any comments.
Hi, hopefully everybody can hear me. My internet is a little bit dicey here, but I just wanted to say thanks to Nikki. I think she's covered everything, but I am here to answer any questions that arise. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to move to the committee and ask if there are any comments or questions at this point. Okay, Jane? Could you just move your microphone closer? Thank you.
Yes, my question is, are the 2 horizontal windows operable? And in my dash comment, so that's question 1, but I'll include this. I wondered if the applicant would consider creating divided lights in these horizontal windows, because I think that would be more sympathetic to the property itself. Although these are on a side wall, so it probably isn't as big an issue as if it were on the front. So operable windows for ventilation, wondering about that, and whether or not they consider some muntins in those windows to make them appear a little more vertical rather than horizontal. Thanks.
Okay, so if staff or the applicant would like to reply.
This is, through you, Madam Chair, this is something I had mentioned and spoken with the agent about. I'm not sure if Alex would like to speak to this, if she is available to.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair. The horizontal windows on the east elevation are intended to be fixed windows, since they really are for garage purposes, more to bring light in, but also they're higher up and horizontal for security purposes. I'm happy to speak with the owner, Dave Wilson, about the potential of muntin bars. Certainly, I appreciate Jane's comment about making them have a more of a vertical appearance, and certainly in this instance, they are fairly hidden from public view, but I'm happy to talk to the owner about that, as he may be perfectly amenable to that change, certainly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anything further, Jane, at this point? Okay. Anyone else from the committee that has questions regarding the application? Gunnar.
Thank you. I am objecting to the shape of the windows. However, they are not very significant and live with that. However, I do have to ask the following question. the garage is not heated, is that correct?
Nikki?
Sorry, through you, Madam Chair. Gunnar, can you just repeat the last part of that question there?
Do you want to just move your microphone a little bit closer?
Oh, the garage is not heated, is that correct?
Not heated.
And the roof abutting to the existing two-story house to the north is flat?
The front, through you, Madam Chair, sorry. The front 2/3 of the structure will have a flat roof, and the rear of the structure will have a roof with the same pitch as the stone wall that runs along the north of the structure.
There's a very high risk that this particular design will compromise the adjacent house. And I think, as stated from a technical point of view, I find it not approvable, and I would ask the proponent to consider ice damming adjacent to the house as a concern, as well as the slab-on-grade approach and the abutment into the existing stone wall. It's flawed, and certainly from this, based on my qualifications, I cannot vote in favor of it. So my move, if I can make a motion, is to ask for a resubmission, or if it is, it can be approved under a designated authority and be made to the Heritage Department as a resubmission, making the corrections.
Okay, so Gunnar, right now we're doing questions. When we call the motion, if you wish to make an amendment, you can do so at that time.
Of course.
Okay.
And through you, Madam Chair, as this is a Part 5 application, there are no amendments possible to the staff application. It is a simply approve or deny, and that will go up to council for final approval.
My apologies. So do you want to proceed with a question or a request then to get some additional information or assurance?
At this point, I'm looking for guidance on what is the most expeditious method to get this resolved.
Okay, Alex, would you like to answer, please?
Sure, through you, Madam Chair. I think I understand what Gunnar is asking about, but what I will just say is the two pitches of the roofs, as I understand it, through working with Glenn Fast, who works with Mac Irvin, the two pitches are not, they are technically considered, flat by definition, but they're not actually flat roofs, and they do have an adequate slope to drain to an eaves trough that is located on the east elevation, so on the side facing 199 Earl Street with the French doors, windows. So in terms of drainage off the building, it has been considered, certainly, and I will say that there has been a lot of discussion around the detailing of the repair of the stone walls and how the new roof will fit over, and how to create a stable surface for that flat roof. So I've actually spoken informally with Edgewater just to confirm a few different approaches to protect the stone wall. So for example, there were discussions about casting a concrete cap to make a flat surface for the roof, but I raised concerns about the potential leaching of salt out of that cement material into the stone wall. So just to assure you, there have actually been a lot of discussions about some of these structural conservation issues, because obviously we've got two very old stone walls, and when you're building new frame construction and basically new construction onto those walls, there are many considerations, and certainly Dave Wilson's got his hand up, so I will just step back now and see if the owner, Dave Wilson, would like to add to this. Thank you very much.
Okay, Mr. Wilson.
Hi, everyone. I am Dave Wilson, the owner of 199 Earl Street. I am also the owner of the adjacent property, 201 Earl Street. So no one has a bigger interest in preserving 201 and keeping water out of it. So we want to do everything technically correct, and we do have that slight slope towards an eaves trough to deal with that. So I just wanted to mention that I'm very interested in making sure we do this properly for both properties. And also regarding the windows, I would be happy not to have any windows as well if it's more heritage pleasing, I guess. So that's all I wanted to offer. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you, Mr. Wilson. So Gunnar, do you have any further questions at this particular point? And I'm just going to make a note to committee that all of your comments will be provided to council as a separate exhibit. So please note that they will be aware of the conversation and your concerns with this. Okay.
Can we summarize the points I raised? One is the abutment of the flat roof against the adjacent building to the north. One. The integration of the slab grade, or the grade slab, or slab on integration of the slab on grade with the existing stone wall. And the avoidance of any ice damming acting on the building to the north.
Okay. Thank you, Gunnar. Is there anything further on questions? Okay. Do any other members of the committee have questions? Okay. Are there any members of the public with questions?
We have no members of the public at present.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I'm now going to put the motion on the floor. The recommendation is that the Kingston Heritage Properties Committee supports council approval of the following. It's quite lengthy, so I won't read through all of it. I believe you have it in front of you. So I need a mover and a seconder, please. Okay, Jane and Jennifer. All right, so now I'll go back to the committee for any further comments or questions on this recommendation. Okay, seeing none, I'll call the vote. All in favor? And that carries unanimously. Thank you. Okay, so moving on, no working groups, permit approvals and status updates. Okay, so I'm going to move to staff to explain the permit approvals and status updates at this point.
Thank you so much, and through you, Madam Chair. So when we had, and with committee support, the suggestion to change some of the procedures by which we report back to committee on the status of permits, in particular, given that we now have these three streams of approval, what we have elected to do is that at every meeting of the Heritage Committee, so right now what you're seeing is all of the delegated approvals that have been issued since the last time we reported to the prior committee. We used to be required to report twice a year. Moving forward, we are required to report at every committee meeting. So what you will see at the next meeting is a table similar to the one that is before you today, and it will let you know if the, ooh, I think I just put pen on my face, so don't zoom in if you're online. What it will let you do moving forward is you can see if it was stream 2 and the committee supported the recommendation and staff supported the recommendation and the applicant received the recommendation with support, that the permit was issued. And we will report that to you so you can see that that has happened. We will also report to you if something has been issued under completely maintenance or staff's delegated authority so that you can track that. And we will also give you an update on the status of applications that have advanced to council. So for example, the demolition on Baden would come back at the next meeting of Heritage Kingston, where you would be able to see what the decision that was rendered at council is. And this again is just to address and make sure that everyone is feeling very comfortable with how things are moving. So the document you see today is a bit longer than the one you will see moving forward. because we did take this opportunity to include all of the delegated authority approvals that had been issued since the last time we reported to the prior committee under the old procedures. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Campbell. Are there any questions from the committee? Jane?
I really appreciate hearing back from council as well at Heritage Kingston. That makes it so much easier for us. Thank you. I don't want to make your job any harder. However, I'm wondering if it would be possible to include a final column or another column saying just what it pertains to, like scope of work.
Through you, Madam Chair. You have anticipated us exactly, Jane. After this was issued, we actually just had an email where we said, wow, we really do need to comment on, what was approved. So yes, that amendment will be made. Thank you.
Any further questions from the committee? Okay, thank you. Okay, so there are no motions, no notices of motions. Any other business? Okay, seeing none, I'm just going to recognize the correspondence. We received 2 pieces of correspondence, one from the Community Heritage Ontario and from Shirley Bailey, so thank you for those. And so then we're on to the date of the next meeting, April 19th at 9:30 a.m. We will all come back here, and I just need somebody to move to adjourn now and second. Okay, so Jennifer and Jane again, tag team over here. All in favor? Okay, thank you, carried. Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you to my vice chair and